welcome to this IPPR event on the future of US-UK trade. I'm Caris Roberts, I'm Executive Director here at the IPPR, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this final event in IPPR's wider programme of work on US-UK trade. We'd like to start with a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce you to our brilliant panellists. So firstly, we'd like to say a big thank you to the European Climate Foundation for their support with this programme. We are recording this session and it will be available on our website following the event, just so that you know. And you can put any questions which you have for our speakers into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will have some time to get to these towards the end of the event. If there's any question that you see in there that you'd particularly like answered, you can upvote it, meaning that we're more likely to come to it. You can also use the chat function to chat with one another, but this won't be monitored for questions. So on this topic, our recent work has explored and set out the opportunities for a new progressive US-UK trade partnership, which could support high environmental and labour standards, tackle the climate crisis and promote inclusive and equitable growth. We think now is a good time to reevaluate the trade relationship and consider the scope for an agenda focused on green and worker-centred trade. In this event, we'll hear from colleagues in the US and the UK, and indeed in Egypt. We've got people joining us from 3 different time zones on the opportunities for future trade and the interlinkages with climate, environmental and labour policy. We're going to start with an overview of our recent report on US-UK trade from IPPR's Marley Morris. Marley is Associate Director for Migration, Trade and Communities at IPPR, and he's been leading on this work. He's the author of Trading Up, our recent report on proposals for a progressive UK-US trade partnership. We're then going to come to contributions from our brilliant panellists in both the US and the UK. With us today, we have Graham Floater, who is the UK's Chief Negotiator for Trade with the United States. He's also the Director for Trade and Services, Investment and Digital at the Department for International Trade. Next up, we have Kathleen Coulson, who's Professor of Law at the University of Miami. She's the author of more than 40 articles and essays concerning trade, investment, and international dispute settlement, among other related research areas. And Kathleen will have to drop off from the event early, unfortunately, but we're delighted that she was able to join us for its start. Next up, we'll have Trevor Sutton, who is Senior Fellow for International Policy at the Centre for American Progress, where he focuses on trade, climate, and international economic issues. Trevor co-authored a recent foreign policy article with Marley on UK-US trade. And then finally, we have Dr. Emily Lydgate, who is a Senior Associate Professor in Environmental Law at the University of Sussex and Deputy Director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory. She is a Specialist Advisor on Trade Agreements to the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee in the UK House of Commons. We will hear from each of our contributors. We'll have a bit of discussion, and then we're going to come to audience Q&A. So do please be preparing and thinking of your questions throughout the event. But without further ado, I wanted to hand over to Marley. Thanks, Marley.
Thanks so much, Caris. So yeah, as Caris said, we've been doing quite a lot of work at IPPR on the UK-US trade relationship. I just wanted to talk through a little bit of our latest thinking based on the report we published in August. I guess the starting point is it's clear that the trade talks between the US and the UK have stalled or effectively frozen. And it does seem that we have 2 quite different, perhaps in some cases, opposing views of trade. On the one hand, the UK post-Brexit is pursuing a free trade agenda aimed at getting as many FTAs as possible, focusing on expanding market access, bringing down tariffs, looking at opportunities around digital trade and so on. And on the other hand, the Biden administration is somewhat more circumspect, is adopting perhaps what some have called more of a managed trade model, exploring the intersection between trade and industrial strategy, focusing on things like supply chain resilience, and interested in how trade relates to other areas of policy, workers' rights, climate, environmental action, and so on. As a result, it's reluctant to sign new FTAs, and it's focusing on different models of trade partnerships. So one example being IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, which is around deepening economic engagement, but doesn't have the same provisions on market access that you might see in traditional FTAs. So we've been looking at IPPR, what this might mean for what a US-UK trade partnership could look like, blending these two approaches, seeing where there is common ground between these two, because despite these differences, there are a number of shared agendas, of parallels between the two countries and the two current governments. So we've looked at three different ways, I guess, that you could develop this partnership, and I'll just touch on them briefly now. First, we propose in our recent report shared in the chat a new framework for progressive trade for the US and UK, following a similar model to IPEF. And the idea is to deepen trade engagement based on shared principles. So one being supporting equitable growth, both domestically and globally, two, addressing the climate and nature crisis, and three, supporting democracy and human rights. So how do you pursue a trade agenda that supports these wider goals? And we've looked at a few different areas where this kind of agenda could be taken forward in more concrete terms. One is, for instance, the UK following the US lead on banning imports of goods made with forced labour, taking a lead from the US book and following a similar approach there. Two, we've looked at how the US and the UK could collaborate on limiting imports of commodities from illegally deforested land, pursuing agendas on deforestation and collaborating on approaches, given both the US and the UK, and in fact the EU are developing policy in this area. Third, thinking about common aims for WTO reform on labour and environment. I think there are clear commonalities there and ways that you could take this forward at the WTO. And finally, a joint approach to tackling carbon leakage, which has proved to be a very controversial issue and very tricky one, but where we think that there's real value in cooperation. So the second area where we've been keen to think about where the UK and the US could work more closely together is more specific, focusing, I think, on where there has been some progress in transatlantic talks in the last year or so. And that focuses on the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminium. The discussions that have taken place that are taking place between the US and the EU on this arrangement. And we've argued that we think it's really important for the UK to be involved in the discussions. That these are discussions which are thinking about how you can support a trading relationship, a transatlantic trading relationship, which supports low carbon trade in steel and aluminium, but which tackles steel and aluminium products with high carbon intensity, as well as addressing issues of overcapacity as well. And we think that there are a few things which the UK could contribute to the discussion, which at the moment it's not directly participating in. So a few areas where we think that the UK could contribute are, firstly, keeping a focus on this arrangement on climate action, rather than just simply protection of domestic industries, making sure this is a really the global arrangement that pursues ambitious climate action. Secondly, pushing forward alongside the US and the EU on developing a common approach to measuring embedded emissions in steel and aluminium products, and also thinking about how to compare pricing and non-pricing policies. Obviously, that's one of the big challenges, I guess, between work between the US and Europe, is that there are very different models of tackling climate action, and so thinking about how you compare those approaches, how you compare pricing and non-pricing policies, we think is really important. Third, thinking about how, I think it's likely we're going to be seeing the future of carbon border adjustments in the EU and perhaps elsewhere, how you introduce those carbon adjustments in a coordinated way, and where appropriate, where you can arrange exemptions where these measures are similarly ambitious in different territories. And then finally, thinking about how you combine measures such as these, which we recognise are contentious and which are often hotly debated, with support for the green transition for steel and aluminium production in developing countries as well. So a very contentious issue. We're keen to discuss it more, but we think that there's a real role for the UK to play in discussions on the global arrangement, and indeed on other models of climate clubs going forward. Finally, we think in the long term, we recognise this is not on the cards at the moment, but in the long term, we think there is a prospect of a US-UK trade agreement, and we want to think about what that might look like. And I guess here the opportunity is how to combine the UK's interest in securing greater market access with the US focus on ambitious commitments on labour, climate, environment. And in fact, actually, we think there are some common interests in both sides on this agenda. We've highlighted a few particular areas where we think there might be commonalities. One is prioritising tariff removal for environmental goods and thinking about how to develop provisions on liberalising trade in environmental services. So that's clearly kind of combining those two agendas around market access and green trade. Secondly, ensuring that any deal has really robust and enforceable non-regression clauses, building on the US approach, which has the automatic assumption that any reduction in standards affects trade, and so making sure that those provisions are enforceable and that they are meaningful. Thirdly, ensuring, and I think this is obviously particularly important in the UK context, that we have strong protections for food hygiene standards. It's a contentious issue, of course, and likely to be a contentious issue in any future negotiations between the UK and the US, but could be really important in helping to resolve the dispute over the Northern Ireland Protocol, which we know that the US has a strong interest in. And then finally, I think something really more ambitious, I guess, around embedding net zero commitments into the FTA and ensuring that there's a real link between commitments made on net zero and climate action and those market access commitments within a free trade agreement, and that we think could really be a kind of be a gold standard for FTAs going forward. And the idea is, how do we build? I guess the idea across all of these three areas: the free trade, the kind of IPEF style framework for progressive trade, and then also the discussions on the global arrangement, is how do you build a model for strong trade relationships between like-minded economies like the US and the UK, which balance the interest in trade liberalisation and on deepening economic engagement, but also with joint action on shared global challenges, issues such as forced labour, on improving labour standards, as well as, of course, on environment and climate action. But yeah, really keen to hear what others think about some of this and the kind of the wider US-UK trade agenda. Thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Marley. I'm going to turn now to our panelists. And so we asked our panelists to have a think about a few key questions before today, particularly around where the US-UK can strengthen trade relations, where there is opportunity for cooperation, but also where there might be disagreement and things to iron out. And then coming back to the kind of the theme of our work on this, how might the US and UK work together on promoting inclusive and worker-centric trade as well as environmental standards. So I'm going to turn first to Graham, and then we'll go to our other panelists.
Thanks a lot, Karis, and very interesting introduction there, and a very interesting report. Let me say a few words about UK-US trade, because we probably don't need reminding, but worth doing anyway, that the US is our single largest trading partner, and that trade relationship is already worth over £230 billion a year. So this is really important, the relationship between the UK and the US. There is already very deep and integrated trade between the two countries, of course, which is partly why it's so large. We also represent two large markets, the US in particular. In 2019, 1.3 million people worked for UK companies in the US, and about 1.5 million worked for US companies in the UK. That gives you an indication of how integrated we are and how important we are to one another for jobs. that's an awful lot of jobs that are reliant on the UK-US trade relationship. And we also think that there are opportunities to deepen that further. We think that there are ways in which we can do that to benefit businesses, consumers, and workers. And that's the goal that we've had in the talks that we have been undertaking with the US over the last year and more. So what about that US-UK trade collaboration? Well, over the last year, we've been discussing a whole range of trade issues that we see as opportunities for us to deepen that relationship. They include digital, they include steel, as was mentioned earlier, clothing, orange juice, beef, lamb, motorbikes. We've been discussing a lot of trade over the last 12 months or more. And it just demonstrates that not only do we already have a very strong trading relationship that works very well, partly because we're two trusted democratic countries with a really good business environment, with a set of values as well that are important. But it's also an indication of how strong the relationship is in terms of the progress that we're continuing to make in terms of going further in terms of market access. And I'm happy to talk about any of those areas in more detail as we go through. In terms of broader cooperation, what was very productive this year was the initiation of two trade dialogues that we had with the US. The first was in Baltimore, the second one was in Aberdeen, and we used those as an opportunity to, first of all, get stakeholders around the table, businesses, NGOs, unions, to really discuss what are the key opportunities and major challenges that the world faces in terms of trade today, and in particular through the perspective of the UK and the US, of course. And on the back of those really interesting and productive discussions, we also had government-to-government talks right up to ministerial level to think through where we could make a difference. And it was at the end of Aberdeen that we saw the joint statement that was published by the USTR, Catherine Tai, and the Secretary of State, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, setting out a number of key areas that we see as being important going forwards. And those were digital. Obviously, the world is becoming ever more digital, and we need to understand how we deal with that. And with the technology that we see advancing at an enormously rapid rate, we've got to have policies in place that are able to address that. And that covers trade as well as covering security, society, and much else. We need to understand what role trade plays in that. We also agreed that the environment needed to be a part of this, including climate action. We included workers' rights and levelling up, understanding that the world in which we live depends on trade. Trade creates all of those jobs that I mentioned earlier and many, many more, particularly in an open trading nation like the UK. How do we ensure that we continue to make trade a driver for jobs and decent jobs that help not only in overall prosperity, but in terms of the quality of life that we want to enjoy in this country, particularly at a time when, as we can see, the global environment is not benign. We also agreed to look at supply chains together, as well as food security. Very important, of course, in terms of the crisis that we're seeing in Russia, Ukraine. You only have to look at the the issue of grain. So we covered a lot of ground, and since then we've had discussions at official level, working some of that through. In terms of environment, just a quick word about where the UK stands on this. It's obviously key to our policy. After all, the UK was the presidency of the last COP. And in terms of our trade policy, it's very much an important component of our trade negotiations, whether that's at the multilateral level, where we've seen the UK reduce its tariffs on environmental goods under the UK global tariff in the WTO, further than others, or whether it's bilaterally with other trading nations in our environmental chapters of our FTAs, which have become a real touchstone for understanding the interface between trade and environment. If you look at the FTAs with Australia, New Zealand and others, you can see their commitments not only to climate and including those under the UNFCCC, but also provisions on CITES, as well as, of course, provisions on environmental standards more broadly. And then on labour, of course, we, as a country, have signed up to the ILO core conventions, International Labour Organization, that is. And again, in our free trade agreements, we include this in the provisions that we have with other countries. And you only have to look at our most recent FTAs to see that. Again, just look at the provisions in Australia or New Zealand. Action against modern slavery as well, of course, very important. And that all plays to the discussions that we had with the US around a worker-centric trade policy, which is very much at the core of the US policy making, and the levelling up agenda, which has been very much at the core of the UK agenda. And in fact, there's a lot of overlap there in terms of ensuring that trade benefits all, and that trade can not only continue to be a major driver of growth for both countries, but also that it can benefit those right across the spectrum. So that's a short summary of where we are in terms of our trade policy in this landscape, and we certainly welcome the contribution that IPPR are making to this debate, as well as more broadly. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Graham, for that very helpful summary. I'll turn now to Kathleen.
Great. Thanks so much, Karis. And thanks to the whole team for the invitation. Congratulations on a terrific report. Very excited to read the latest and update on everything, all of our conversations over the last year. And I'm happy to follow Graham in a way, because I want to pick up where he left off and maybe elaborate somewhat on the worker-centered trade policy piece, and how the US and UK might work together on promoting inclusive and worker-centered trade. I think there are a lot of potential actions, and as I'm sure we can talk about at much greater length, the forward path of both governments will be a key factor here. Midterm elections, the new government in the UK, but I think there's some low-hanging fruit, and I just want to touch on two main points and then circle back to the politics of it all. So the US worker-centered trade policy, I usually think of it in three different buckets: workers at home, workers abroad, and workers under duress. Now, we don't have time to get into all three buckets, but let's just focus on the latter two: workers abroad and workers under duress. Things have not really changed since we started this conversation last year. And what I said at that time was that there was a great deal of emphasis on enforcement. And that's still very much the case, whether we're talking about the forced labor context, whether we're talking about collective bargaining and going through those ILO conventions that Graham mentioned and enforcing them with our trading partners. That's still very much the focus. And again, as Graham mentioned, in the formation of policy, likewise, engaging with workers and workers groups has been taking place throughout the last year. What is increasingly the focus of this worker-centered trade policy, if there was one thing I would leave everybody with, one thing I'd wish to emphasize, is this increased US focus on corporate accountability. companies as targets in US trade tools to achieve the goals that you've heard about, whether we're talking about the worker-centered trade policy or what some US officials think of as trades values. You're increasingly hearing that language. And so while we might used to think of this as a state-to-state exercise, and that's still very much the case, but it's also increasingly looking at how we can get our major companies to make sure that in their workplaces around the world, starting with Mexico under the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, that there's no worker, there's ability rather for workers to be able to bargain collectively, to unionize, and no interference with those activities. So the US, including the Congress right now, the US Biden administration, the Congress are working together now on, I think, what is the right interagency focus? What are the different agencies that will be involved in that money being funneled across the trade bureaucracy to get that done? So this is a change, right, in the way that we've thought about our trade tools before. It's primarily a domestic issue in how we do that internally, but there's a sense that we'll be much more successful if we coordinate that with partners. And so hence the US-UK relationship. This coordination, we need a united front. And I think it aligns very much, as Graham suggested, with the leveling up idea. And I imagine there are lessons to learn in both directions, comparing notes on how we do inclusivity, all of these best practices that we can share on these shared goals. So that's the first thing I wanted to emphasize, that how our enforcement idea has changed somewhat in this corporate accountability space, but the worker-centered trade policy still is the focal point. Second is how the UK is a different kind of trading partner. And this is at the risk of pointing out the obvious, that labor is not, were we to have a free trade agreement, which we know is not high on the agenda at present, but if we were to have an ambitious FTA, as the report suggests we could, there's not a concern, as there might be with some trading partners, about what's happening in the UK on that score, at least not to the degree that we would imagine elsewhere. And so it's not, I think, a sort of primary focus, except perhaps should we come to that space of digital trade, where the companies, the countries, again, I think could work very much together to think about what is a worker-centered trade policy, what does inclusivity mean in the digital space. That's where a lot of the thinking is right now. And I think the advantage of working with a partner who has similar goals is that they can work together on normative developments to think about what does that mean and to add those new sorts of commitments in their shared collaboration going forward. Another point on which they can collaborate, whether do they use a council or an agreement, would be on that forced labor issue. And that's something I think that most trading partners would agree on, that is that we want to put an end to forced labor, and one in which that coordination will be so critically important. Finally, the last topic I wanted to come back to of my three was that of the politics. And this is really a bit of the unknown, right? Whether we're talking about the midterms taking place tomorrow in the United States or watching the future of UK politics as well. Just on the US for a moment, as you will know, the reason we are quite certain we're not moving toward an FTA right now is the lack of trade promotion authority, that system that we have in the US that moves trade agreements through our Congress on a fast track. And so the Biden administration has not suggested any interest in resuming that process and reinstituting the TPA process. But you do hear some members of Congress say, let's get back on it. Let's make sure we get back to our FTA agenda. Instead, what we're doing in the Biden administration, what we're hearing about from the Biden administration are these, let's call them trade executive agreements. These are agreements that don't go through Congress, but that seek to achieve trade-related goals. Primary example of this is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which our ambassador, Catherine Tai, talks about as being very similar to TPP, now CPTPP, as we know, but just how close they can come without market access is, of course, the heart of the issue. Some skepticism, I think, on the part of many in the United States that IPEF, as it's called, can actually achieve those same goals, but those are the same sorts of ambitious points that the US is going after, the same progressive agenda that they sought to achieve in TPP. Those issues are on the table likewise in IPEF. So we'll see what happens. I'll leave it there and turn the floor back over to you, Karis. Thanks so much again for the invitation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kathleen, and thanks so much for joining us. Trevor, over to you next.
Great, thanks so much. And I should offer a caveat up front that I'm speaking to you from Egypt, where I'm here for the COP27. So if my internet gets a little wobbly, that's likely the reason. I have the challenge of coming after Kathleen, who was my law school classmate, and I think predictably will excel relative to me in every way. But I'll offer what little insights I have here. I think Kathleen hit on some really astute points when she talked about sort of what a trade policy looks like and what the Biden administration is trying to achieve. I think that, for a lot of people, it's a little difficult to wrap their head around the idea of a trade policy whose aim isn't to reduce trade barriers or facilitate more trade between two countries. I think that certainly in the post-Cold War era, that definition was sort of synonymous with trade policy. That's what trade policy is supposed to do. That's what trade negotiators would seek to achieve, and that this liberalization would reduce inefficiencies and sort of the global economy and reduce and create sort of net gains, for all parties. I think that there has been a pretty sharp turnabout, on the sort of on the wisdom, on the prudence of that sort of view of trade policy. And what you're hearing now is trade policy is about alignment on standards and principles, particularly among like-minded countries that share similar values, in order to shape the international economy and markets in a way that allows us to better confront and manage global challenges. Above all, I think climate, but in addition, the challenge of human rights abuses, labor abuses, other forms of environmental degradation like deforestation, even something as you might think sort of orthogonal to global trade is anti-corruption, which is included in one of the 4 pillars of IPEF. So I think when critics point to something like IPEF and say, well, it doesn't have any sort of market access provisions, it's not going to be enforceable. I think in many respects that's sort of assuming that's the goal of trade policy, and that's not. At least for the administration at the moment, and I think for much of Congress as well. To bring this back to the US-UK trade relationship, I mean, it's my view that, listen, as the first and the 6th largest global economies, in many ways, sort of the most powerful influence that sort of greater alignment between the two countries and the two economies can have is in precisely what I just described in shaping market standards. I think you can definitely see that, in the case of sort of deforestation and forced labor. We don't necessarily share the same supply chains there. And you can imagine there's not a lot of traded goods between the two countries that sort of involve high levels of deforestation or forced labor, certainly that were produced in either the US or the UK. At the same time, if we can align on those, and that would mean, if the US can pass the Forest Act, or the UK could pass something like the Section 301 of the Tariff Act, the sort of cascading effects on sort of global supply chains will be very significant. Now, this, of course, gets to the question, sorry, I should say that's one. And then the other one I would highlight is, and this is perhaps even more important with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, if the US and the UK can come to some sort of greater agreement or perspective on reconciling industrial policy and the very challenging questions of political economy that countries will have to square with meeting the climate crisis. So, in the case of IRA, we have industrial policy, right? We are entering a new era of industrial policy. Many countries look at that sort of legislation and think that it doesn't really comply with existing principles of how trade should operate. It looks like it's sort of protectionist or subsidies under the name of climate action. I think that from the U.S. perspective, there was a good faith effort to do whatever they could to get across the line to sort of make the investments that would meet the sort of existential crisis of climate change, and that our trading partners and economic partners, particularly ones that share similar values, should be more accommodating of the compromises we have to make. And so I think that's another example where the U.S. and UK could I think lead the way, I think, for much of the world if they can sort of find a way forward on sort of aligning industrial policy and climate action with trade rules. So, so those are sort of two buckets. And the one question that comes up a lot, certainly in the context of IPEF, is, okay, well, fine, you do this, but then what does it actually mean to enforce these standards or provisions? How, are these just sort of statements, general statements of principle on paper? I guess my answer is yes. particularly in the USUK case. Obviously, you can't have some sort of joint statement of principle that will then, cause the U.S. to pass an act of Congress, as it would need in the deforestation case. But having these shared principles, I think, can till the soil for some sort of more meaningful FTA down the road, and you can kind of align around the policy areas that if you did have an FTA, you'd want to prioritize and lift up. So if you identify forced labor, if you identify deforestation, if you identify some sort of joint approach on carbon border adjustment and measurement of carbon emissions, I think that can sort of be a runway to a progressive FTA of the kind that we haven't seen. So I'll leave it there and turn it back to you.
Fantastic, thank you, Trevor. And then finally over to you, Emily.
Thank you for inviting me. And I should say that I am a result of the productive trade relationship between the US and the UK that Graham mentioned, because I am a US export to the UK. And I thought I would address what seemed to me to be some of the positives of US-UK trade cooperation, and also some of the obstacles or challenges. So with respect to the positives, I suppose from an IPPR perspective in particular, the US now has a progressive trade agenda. So, if we look at the discussion areas in the UK-US joint statement after the talks in Aberdeen in the spring, there's a good amount of overlap with your recent report, Marley. So, where there's worker-centered trade, green trade, climate cooperation, they're all on the agenda. And let's take a moment to remember that a couple of years ago in progressive circles in the UK, a US trade deal was basically seen as a symbol for lowered environment and consumer protection standards. So, this shift in the US to, you could call it managed trade, you could call it values-based trade, you could call it friendshoring, opens up possibilities for alignment on progressive trade. But what are the sort of practical opportunities to do so? As a number of people have already said, even as the prospect of a US FTA is starting to seem a bit more appealing to some of us, the chances of it happening have diminished. And I can remember USTR for a long time being really interested in a UK FTA, not only for its own sake or on its own terms, but because it seemed to offer the promise of sort of helping broker an FTA with the EU, helping put pressure on the EU for some of the regulatory issues that the US isn't fond of. And that sort of source of UK strategic positioning seems to have a bit less leverage now in that respect, just because of this move away from traditional FTAs. But I still think that is a really useful dynamic, and I'll circle back to that in a second. I think we also should keep in mind, right, that the projected economic benefit of this FTA was not great, right? I think DIT estimated that it would be worth 0.16% of GDP. So you could argue that it was always just as much of symbolic importance as it was of sort of economic importance, that we were moving away from the EU, so we had to realign our strategically. And the tariffs that it presumably would have removed aren't that great, particularly on the US side towards the UK. The UK has a few, we've got our bicycles and our vehicles and our agri-food, which I'm sure the US would quite like to see go away. But the big gains in US-UK trade have always been regulatory cooperation. So then the question becomes, to what extent can we do that outside of a traditional FTA? And there's certainly, scope for cooperation. So let's remember that a big victory for the UK in US trade last year was the US removing its ban on UK lamb, which was basically a hangover from the BSE crisis. That didn't require an FTA at all, just some sort of good diplomacy behind the scenes. And I share sort of Trevor's question about these very high-level regulatory cooperation efforts, such as we have it in the IPEF, and the idea of having a sort of UK-US IPEF. I think it's an interesting existential question for the trade community as a whole. If you take the sort of the trade in the traditional sense out of a trade agreement, and by that I mean tariff reductions, rules of origin, services schedules, dispute settlement, is that a step forward because the regulatory issues are the ones we really need to unpick? Or is it just a bunch of paper that's never going to do anything? So I think that's a broader question that we could ask of UK-US trade cooperation, but also just the trade system in general. But obviously, as Graham underscored, there are already dialogues going on towards building cooperation. I'll just say one other thing, which is Marley emphasized these opportunities for climate cooperation through trade. And this is where, it seems to me that the UK has, this is potential for an interesting kind of mid-Atlantic positioning. Why is that? Well, I think the UK has an impulse to be a bridge builder in this area, although they've kept their cards very close to their chest. So this is just me sort of trying to psychoanalyze the UK government, but they want a multilateral solution. They're very familiar with the EU approach. They've been part of that approach, and they face a lot of the same issues that the EU is facing. But I think they're really in a space where they would benefit from a compromise-based approach, in particular because they're very exposed to CBAM, not the price, but the regulatory implications of it. It's going to be a big problem for UK exporters. So I think the UK could bring some interesting fresh perspectives to the table and help broker a deal about issues like how to recognize equivalence between climate systems. And I thought there was a kind of a lost opportunity there for the UK to take leadership on the climate club issue during the G7 presidency. So I was really annoyed when Germany stepped up and did that, because I really wanted the UK to take that one on. Not that it's necessarily, I think it's been sort of eclipsed by other issues. So challenges, the fact that the UK doesn't have a good relationship with the EU, that can really hinder convergence in a lot of ways. So Marley mentioned the proposed general agreement on sustainable steel and aluminium, which essentially is trying to unpick some of the issues that, I just referred to in terms of how do we recognize different regulatory systems as being equivalent. The UK hasn't really engaged fully with that process. I don't know what's happening there, but I would suspect that the EU's reluctance to engage with the UK may play a part in that. And of course, another factor that's emerged since Biden took office is this concern about the Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement, and that has implications for maintaining good relations generally. Another concern is that the UK will just get sort of sidelined. So for example, the US New Inflation Reduction Act has really angered the EU. And it affects the UK for the same reasons, but the only countries that are exempted from the particularly discriminatory subsidies requirements are Mexico and Canada, and for batteries, countries with which the US has an FTA. So obviously the EU has been quite a bit in the news about this, but it would be useful for the UK to be able to join forces with the EU as well. So I think the common point in both of those is that, the UK has to make a strong case that it's a useful friend in the sort of the friendshoring agenda, but also work well with the EU to enhance its ability to kind of build a bridge between the US and the EU. I think there's been obviously a lot of political instability in the UK, so we're still kind of trying to figure out what the UK's positioning would be on some of these big geopolitical strategic issues like China, for example. And I will definitely read with interest the next integrated review, because I think that will help us understand where Rishi Sunak is coming from on foreign policy, and in particular on China, which is significant for the US from the climate cooperation perspective, and also just the broader perspective of geopolitical alliances. So I will stop there.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Emily. A really rich discussion so far. And I've also got a lot of questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to turn straight to some of our audience questions, actually, rather than abusing my position as chair and taking up too much time. So I thought I might start. There are some questions that are directed to you, Graham, but perhaps others might want to come in as well if they want to. One is from Rosa, who says, thanks for the update, Graham. The TUC took part in the UK-US trade dialogue in Aberdeen, and another issue discussed was how the UK and US can work together at the WTO to ensure WTO rules ensure respect for ILO standards. Can you update us on how this has featured in these discussions with US officials? Do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, thanks. And I just wanted to say, very interesting listening to the other panelists. You've got some real expertise here. today, which is great to hear. Yes, I mean, obviously we look at the multilateral level and the bilateral level. There are multiple dimensions here. When you get to the multilateral level, you're dealing with a range of different countries, and the interface that we have with that and the US has with that increases the complexity. But some of the areas that we have been discussing that are clearly of mutual interest to both countries include supply chains. Supply chains, as the panel has been discussing earlier, are not just a caricatured trade relationship between two countries where one country produces something and sells it into the other country. We live in a world that is extremely sophisticated when it comes to value chains that can go around the world several times over. And so understanding those supply chains or global value chains is really important. It's important in terms of ensuring that we maintain global trade, which continues to be a major driver of jobs and growth in our countries. But it's also important in terms of how products are made, the type of standards that are used in other countries, and so on. And so I agree with some of the discussion we've heard that the relationship between the UK and the US from a trade perspective is not only about market access, although it is about that, and we've had some major successes there over the last year. But it's also about working together at a multilateral level in order to address some really serious concerns about modern slavery, about enforced labor, and so on. So this is really a really important element of the discussions that we had, not only in Baltimore and Aberdeen, but before and after. So that's one of the major things that we've engaged with the US on. Another is food security. Food security is not an issue that is simply bilateral. It's very much a question of how we can work together as part of an international community to ensure that there is food security for all in a world where supply chains can be disrupted very rapidly and very severely, as we've seen in our own backyard recently, but we see in other parts of the world as well on a relatively regular basis. And that's something that we want to continue to work with our US counterparts on as well. We also work, of course, very closely with the US on the WTO more generally, whether that's issues in the WTO that I discussed. There were many at the ministerial, the MC12, most recently. Obviously, we work with our US colleagues as well as others in that multilateral forum, as well as WTO reform. So there are many issues that we work closely with the US on from a multilateral perspective as well as a bilateral perspective. The most important thing in that relationship is that we are joined up and we work on these issues in a coherent way. And that's what we've been able to do. And I have every confidence that we'll be able to continue to do that.
Thanks very much. And while we're on the WTO, there's a question from Johnny here about whether the UK is raising the WTO incompatible elements of the Inflation Reduction Act with the US. Is that something that's on your agenda?
Well, obviously that's ongoing. We've just seen a public consultation that was put out by the US Treasury. That's something that we've been following closely. We've obviously been discussing with US colleagues about it. One of the most important things is that as we move forward, we have an ability to work with our allies in a way that ensures that supply chains are fair and that, as we said earlier, don't involve modern slavery and forced labor, and that we maintain a level of standards that we enjoy in this country. We enjoy very high labor and environmental standards in the UK compared to the world at large, and that's something that is very important to us. It's clearly very important to the US administration. So all of this needs to be taken into account, as well as the interface with our work on climate change, and however we come through our trade policy with the US and more broadly with other partners, we need to have an environment where trade continues to flow so it can benefit businesses, but also workers and also consumers. All of us, we all benefit from trade, every one of us. We've got to ensure that that continues whilst addressing some of these other issues. How we get there is a challenge, and that's part of the discussions that we've regularly been having with the US and will continue to.
Great. I'm going to stick with this kind of multilateral institution point and multilateralism more generally, with a question from Liz that is, if trade policy is increasingly about like-minded countries coming together and setting norms or agreeing approaches to big global challenges, what does this mean for multilateralism, and how are less powerful countries' needs represented? I don't know if any of our other panelists would like to come in on that one. Trevor, is that you?
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, so one of the challenges here is the interests of less powerful countries. I think one of the more difficult things is that I think in the trade space, I think the usual sort of conception of sort of the interests of powerful countries versus less powerful is a little bit inverted. I think that there's a sort of in the international relations space, there's a kind of convention that less powerful countries are sort of more committed to these sort of grand sort of norms and principles in international law that are sort of more constraining of the powerful countries like the United States, which bristle against them. I think that in the trade space, I mean, often sort of it's the less wealthy, sort of less powerful in the conventional sense countries that favor lower regulatory standards, that favor lower compliance or enforcement standards, from a government perspective. And I think that has to be distinguished from the perspective of climate advocates on the ground in less powerful countries, and from the perspective of labor advocates on the ground who suffer because of, I would say, the deregulatory agenda of global trade rules as they existed, for most of the last 30 years. So it's a little bit tricky. I would say that if you have sort of 5 or 6 of the most powerful, wealthy economies coming together, agreeing on sort of higher standards around labor, higher standards around climate in a way that has some enforceability, is that over the opposition of, say, countries that benefit from lower labor standards and lax enforcement? Is that not accounting for the interests of less powerful countries? I don't know. You get to the question of what are those interests? I mean, to take the example of the USMCA. The USMCA has clearly been a huge boon for labor organization in Mexico, but this was a provision that the Mexican government sort of and Mexican business fiercely resisted. So, again, I think it's a little bit sort of facile to sort of pitch it as sort of less and more powerful countries. I think that when you're talking about trade, you have different constituencies with different interests. And in the US, I think the constituencies and interests that the Biden administration is sort of most focused on, and I think rightly so right now, because they're sort of anchored in our sort of democratic values and progressive values, are those of labor and those of the environment. So that's how I'd answer that. I could imagine others having a different perspective, but.
Emily, Marley, would you like to come in on this point?
Go ahead, Marley.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. So wasn't sure if Emily was going to, I think, this is something that I think has become clear from some of the previous discussions we've had and some other conversations we've had, that there's a real tension, I think, between some of the proposals being talked about, whether it's climate clubs, whether it's the kind of proposals that are in the IPPR report that I published over the summer around building strong ties between like-minded countries and some of the real concerns, I think, of I think framed in the question, less powerful countries, about the implications for them. I mean, I think it's become clear with the EU's proposal for a carbon border adjustment mechanism, there are real concerns about the implications for poorer countries. And I think there's a worry that some of the arguments that tie trade policy and climate action become effectively kind of protectionist measures that harm the interests of more developing nations, and that's clearly a real concern, and I think it does need to be addressed head on. And I think it feels like, yeah, in some of the conversations that that needs to be brought out more clearly, I guess, because I think it's a real challenge for progressives. I think first of all, I'd say I think Trevor makes a fair point that you can't just think about the interests of a country in and of themselves. There are different interests within countries. Trade unions and workers might have their own interests. Of course, yeah, the example of the rapid response mechanism is a good one. Real strong interest for Mexican workers in having that agreement to protect their rights. But Mexican businesses might have a different perspective. So I think that's a really important one. I think it's important also that, and this is why we emphasized in our report, that any of the measures that are focused on ensuring higher standards, tackling carbon leakage, are targeted specifically at climate environmental action and don't become a route into weakening, a route into protectionist measures or into protecting domestic industries at the expense of developing nations. I think that's a real concern. And I think third, we've made very clear, we think that any trade measures that are potentially could harm developing countries need to be complemented by measures to speed up and support and contribute to the green transition, and there needs to be major fiscal investments alongside any trade measures such as carbon border adjustments or measures that, for instance, put new import standards or restrictions through trade agreements. So yeah, I think it is a contentious issue, and I think it's a very delicate one, but I'm also keen to hear what Emily says. I know she's done a lot of work on this.
Those were both incredibly thoughtful answers, but I mean, I guess from where I'm sitting, the issues they've been more or less the same, for the past 20 years, in the sense that there's always a concern that, the idea of managed trade or conditional trade essentially implies more and more complex and fantastical regulatory requirements being met before goods can come into a particular country. And some of the EU's latest initiatives are pretty spectacular in this respect. Just thinking about the amount of monitoring and paperwork and assessment and auditing, et cetera, that needs to happen before they can before you can export. And that's true of a lot of the due diligence requirements as well as the CBAM proposals. So is that good? There are positives and negatives, and a lot of the negatives disproportionately affect not only developing countries but also SMEs. It's fundamentally, I think, a question about, is regulation good? And we need regulation, but how do we regulate and who is affected by that? It's very difficult to plan regulation so that it achieves its objectives optimally.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to our next topic now, and it's a question from Johnny. It's actually two questions which relate. So one is about whether there are clear UK-US objectives on climate and environment, And then the second is, what is the UK's position on the global arrangement on steel and aluminium? Or if the UK isn't engaging on this, is the UK engaging the US on carbon leakage and embedded carbon more generally? Graham, do you want to start with those?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of objectives, the trade dialogues that we mentioned earlier in Baltimore and Aberdeen set out a framework for our discussions. And that's a broad framework. It's going to take time to be able to get a hold of these very thorny issues of the interface between trade and climate. I think we all recognize that it's highly challenging, but I think we also all recognize that that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing anything about it. Far from it. We need to be getting involved and really thinking this through. Clearly, there are going to be some areas that are easier to address in the shorter term, and there are going to be other issues that are going to be a long haul. So the first thing to say is that nothing is off the table. And we need to continue to engage with the US on the full range, not only of climate policies, but also in terms of broader environmental goals as well. So that's on that more broadly. In terms of the specifics of steel, we undertook a negotiation with the US this year on the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminium. We, of course, felt, along with some other countries, that those tariffs were unfair, and it prevented UK steel entering the US freely. So we entered into those negotiations. On the other side of the equation, rebalancing measures have been put in place, covering a whole range of US products into the UK. And we went into those negotiations in a spirit of collaboration on both sides. And I have to say, it was a really good set of talks, and we came out with a resolution that I think was a very sensible one all around. And it means now that we have a tariff rate quota, which effectively means that UK steel can enter the US market tariff-free. Now, as part of those negotiations and as part of the resolution, we discussed low carbon steel. So it's something that was very important to both sides to discuss. I think it's important to remember that there isn't a global arrangement as such, or even negotiations amongst a group of countries in that direction. There are simply bilateral discussions that are taking place. And one of the things that we wanted to ensure as part of the negotiations on steel and aluminium was that, first of all, we put forward our position, the UK position, on ensuring that we move towards net zero. The US heard that, understood it, and I think were pretty impressed by it. And at the same time, the US put forward their interest in ensuring that we could move to a greener approach to trade. So all of that to say that we got through those talks and were able to get to a resolution on that, which included the importance of the discussion on low carbon steel. So, you know, there's plenty to discuss for the future on this. It is challenging, but we are not wavering over the importance of it or taking action on it. So we'll have to see how that pans out. It'll also be interesting to see whether anything comes out of the bilateral discussions that the US and the EU are having. Those are obviously not for us or for other countries, but nevertheless of interest. So that's where we are on all of that. And as I said before, we need to see all of this in the round. This isn't just about one issue or another. It's about how we can get a better interface between trade and environment, trade and climate overall. And that was the purpose of Aberdeen, which went much more widely than that, following the resolution at the previous trade dialogue that we had in Baltimore of the steel and aluminium issue that we managed to get through.
Thanks, Graham. Trevor, was that a momentary hand up? Would you like to come in?
There was. I didn't. If someone else wanted to jump in before, I didn't want to. I didn't want to deny them the opportunity.
I think you're welcome to.
Sure. No, I wanted to pull on Emily's really astute, observation that the UK can potentially sort of play a kind of mid-Atlantic perspective, I think on these key issues around how do you reconcile a carbon border adjustment system, or premised on explicit carbon price versus one that has not, where there's an implicit or not a carbon price at all. And also sort of how do you reconcile sort of industrial policy aimed at sort of advancing an ambitious climate agenda with trade rules. I mean, I think the US and the UK, US and the EU really are metaphorically and actually oceans apart on this. And I think that, if the UK, I think, has an interesting choice ahead of it, which is that does it want to align itself with the EU, where I think in terms of sort of the structure of its economy, it has more in common with the EU, and certainly sort of more to lose if you're looking at sort of IRA, or does it want to sort of try to play an intermediary role and try to sort of show a way forward? Does it want to sort of have a constructive negotiation with the US about explicit versus implicit carbon pricing? It doesn't want to find a way to resolve the IRA WTO issue in a way that avoids litigation and maybe sets a sort of path forward for how you handle this kind of industrial policy question going forward. I don't know, but I do think, there's an interesting sort of a strategic question for the UK on how it wants to position itself as, I think, this Gulf This also is the case on China as well, where the US is sort of recent export controls are obviously disquieting to many in Europe because they sort of implicate European manufacturing, European supply chain. So, how do you manage that Gulf as well? So I think, I do think to the extent the UK sort of wants to be a trade leader, there's a niche, a position, that it can occupy in sort of bridging that Gulf in a mid-Atlantic capacity, whether that makes sense, from and the broader question of what the UK's overall policy interests are. Obviously can't answer that, but it's an interesting sort of idea to ponder.
Thanks. Emily, I wondered if you want to come in on this as well, and particularly thinking about the steel and aluminium point.
I mean, I don't know if I really have anything to add specifically on that. I think that I've heard really mixed reviews about how likely this is to even happen. But it's certainly an attention getter. And I think the reason it's such an attention getter is precisely because the issues that it purports to resolve are important ones that aren't going away. And they aren't going away for the UK particularly as well, because the UK is, as I said, very exposed to CBAM from an administrative perspective. And the UK's producers are paying pretty much the exact same carbon price as those in the EU. So it has the same pressures domestically, it's exposed to the EU, and also potentially, trade divergence if the EU has a CBAM and it doesn't. So to me, the moral of the story is that there's no comfortable path. There's going to have to be some sort of, action, and working together with trade partners seems to be a preferable way of going about it, rather than just erecting a bunch of unnecessary trade barriers. But then the big question which comes with that, I think, is, in a way, I see it as two issues. One of them is, how can we reduce trade barriers that result from sort of concerns about carbon pricing and implicit or explicit between what you might describe as climate allies and the developed world, and the other one is how to prevent unintended consequences on poor countries who might not be in the room, and so I think it's both of those dimensions, and we kind of talked about the latter one before, so I won't say anything else about that.
Great, thanks. I realise we're kind of drawing towards the end of our session, so I've got a couple more questions I'll squeeze in before we come to closing remarks. Mali, I wondered if you might answer Guy's, which is that the USMCA rapid response mechanism is mentioned in the IPPR report, guaranteeing rights of free association and collective bargaining. Could similar mechanisms play a role in UK worker-centred trade policy?
Sure, I can give that a go. Yeah, I think we would certainly be in favour of exploring how such a mechanism might work in a UK context, but I think it requires a bit of thought. I think first of all, it's worth saying that I think it's very unlikely that the US, and I think this is drawing from conversations I've had with others, including Kathleen, who sadly had to leave, but I think it's unlikely that the US would expect there to be such a mechanism in any deal with the UK, for the very reason that Kathleen mentioned earlier, which is that the US doesn't see the UK as a concern when it comes to labour rights, and so it wouldn't expect that kind of provision in any deal. I think it would, and I mentioned this briefly earlier on, I think it would expect, just as a new baseline in any deal, I think, to have the burden of proof when it comes to the link between trade and reduction of standards to be reversed, so that there's just a general assumption between that any reduction of standards impacts on trade or investment, which is what the USMCA does. So that's, I think, could kind of carry through into any UK-US deal, and I think certainly the UK should adopt that approach in general, I think, when it comes to its free trade agreements. The rapid response mechanism is quite a specific arrangement for in the Mexican context. So, you couldn't necessarily apply it across, but I think there are elements that are interesting, particularly the fact that, in the idea of having individuals being able to make complaints, and having that kind of individual kind of firm-based response, which I think is interesting to think about in the UK context, because one of the issues we've had, I guess, with trade and labour provisions in the past with the kind of UK when the UK was a member of the EU, is that they haven't been particularly effective or enforceable. And so thinking about how you make those enforceable and potentially having those types of provisions could be a way forward. But yeah, it's obviously a specific provision for particular contexts.
I've got two hands up for this topic. Graham, did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, rapid response is very specific to the USMCA context. I mean, just to say that some of the discussions that we've had, the stakeholder discussions that we've had, which have been very interesting, have really highlighted, just how high labour standards are in the UK. I mean, if you look at the national living wage of $9.50 an hour for those aged 23 or over, annual leave of 28 days minimum for full-time employees, maternity leave of up 52 weeks, paternity leave, sick pay, where we have almost £100 a week up to 28 weeks. The US don't have these levels of labour rights, and they have their own systems, they have their own legislation in place. But I think what we can do is to demonstrate what a highly prosperous free trading nation can do in terms of really strong labour standards and also environmental standards as well. And I think the US appreciate that. They're learning. They are wanting to understand other systems. And I think that's where we can work very well together. So I think there is an opportunity here for the US to pick up some of the lessons that we have learned over many decades, and also for us to work closely together in terms of some of these issues that go beyond the border between our two countries, back to those issues that we talked about earlier around modern slavery and enforced labour that we're unfortunately seeing in some supply chains. That's something that we need to be looking at and trying to address. So I think from that perspective, to compare the UK-US relationship with the US-Mexico relationship, for instance, it is not really too helpful given the very different starting points that we're coming at it from. But just to say again that these are two countries coming together with an understanding that these issues need to be addressed.
Is that your read as well, Trevor?
Yeah, let me be the third person to say that I have my doubts about the generalizability of the rapid response mechanism. I think there are questions over whether that could apply in any other trading relationship, even one with another sort of, developing country. And could you have similar mechanism for, US-Vietnam trade? I think the sort of the interconnectedness of the US-Mexico supply chains, how many sectors it covers, and also the logistics of enforcement are just much more possible because of that sort of geographic relationship. It's hard to imagine what it would even look like in many other contexts, let alone between two developed economies. But I do think the question raises an interesting point. To the extent the US and UK ever get to an FTA, to what extent will the provisions of it be more about, I think, sort of setting a template, sort of setting a model for other FTAs as opposed to actually sort of using them in an aggressive enforcement context. So take, for example, like net zero commitments, right, in an FTA. Is it likely that the US or the UK are going to impose trade sanctions on each other because we failed to live up to our net zero commitments? I find that highly unlikely. At the same time, if you set that precedent in an FTA, and the more those sorts of provisions show up in FTAs, does that mean that they show up in other FTAs between countries where such enforcement could actually have more meaning? And so I do think that's sort of an interesting question going forward when the US does resume negotiating FTAs, which I think it will at some point. What does a new FTA look like, and to what extent is it about sort of creating a model that will lend itself to, I think, advancing the kind of values that the US and UK share in other trading relationships. So.
Fantastic. I'm going to come now to all of our speakers for some closing remarks. I am going to invite you, just because there's been so many good questions, to just look in the Q&A, because there are 3 remaining questions that you might want to pick up in your final remarks. There's one from Alec on the ability of companies to sue states for loss of profits due to legislative changes and whether that will remain in a trade agreement. There's one from Morrison about the UK's position on trade and services with the US, and particularly financial services. And there's one from Stephen on whether either side is reviewing prior to agreeing and signing a trade agreement, if anyone's assessing how the benefits of the agreement are distributed. So is there a kind of distribution analysis for, I guess, workers in those countries being done, or might there be? But in terms of closing remarks, I'm also interested to hear kind of what you think is coming next and what your priorities for what happens next would be. I'm going to pick on Marley to start.
Thanks, Karis. Yeah, I think, well, just looking at those questions, I guess the first one, certainly we'd not be in favour of having ISDS in any future UK trade agreement, well, with any countries. That's our general position on that. But I guess it's I guess we'll see when it comes to that. I think there are obviously, as I mentioned before, there are a number of big contentious issues when it comes to a free trade agreement between the UK and the US that haven't gone away. And I think that's important to bear in mind, whether it's about ISDS or perhaps also on questions of food safety standards as well. I think just some final thoughts from me. I think just picking up on the earlier conversation, I think Emily made a really good point about the kind of position of the UK vis-a-vis the US and the EU, and where it's positioned when it comes to on climate action. And I guess fundamentally there are quite fundamental big differences between the US approach on climate, which particularly since the Inflation Reduction Act largely focused on big subsidies, and the EU approach, which is focused much more on carbon pricing. And clearly that's playing out when it comes to how to manage the trade relationship. And I think I have some sympathy, I think, with what Emily hinted at earlier, which is that it could be quite difficult for the US and the EU to come to any form of agreement when it comes to the global arrangement. I guess there are different views on this, but it seems like quite a challenge given the different places where they're starting. So that poses an interesting question, which is, can the UK play a useful role kind of between the two? And I think in principle it can. I guess the challenge is that the politics in the UK make it very difficult, because the UK, I think, is pretty reluctant to align itself too closely to the EU's emissions trading system and to the CBAM. I think it's hard to say, and obviously we've had lots of different changes of administration in the last few months alone, but it does seem that the UK is still quite reluctant to go down the path of the CBAM. It might feel like it has to if there's no other alternative, but I think it seems to favour a multilateral approach in general. So I think it's a bit difficult and a kind of thorny position for the UK to be in, but I do sympathise with what others have said earlier, which is that I think it's best in this situation, rather than keeping quiet, to take a proactive role, to set out where we stand and to engage constructively and to participate in the discussions where we can, to set out our agenda, because this is in a way the moment where we can have influence and set a policy direction. So I think it's perhaps a good opportunity for the new administration to do that.
Fantastic, thank you. Trevor, I'll ask you to go next. I'm going to ask you to be strict on timing so that we can finish punctually.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I mean, I just think there are two things that are going to need to be resolved that are going to dominate conversations around trade. One is, of course, this question of, as I mentioned earlier, the relationship between trade, industrial policy, and climate. I just think that needs to get hammered out one way or the other. You know, if the EU goes ahead with the WTO sort of, action against the US, it will be interesting to see how that plays out. And will that result in the WTO system being further weakened, or some new consensus around these issues? Two, the question of decoupling from China. This is something where the US is barreling full steam ahead. The export controls were sort of unprecedented, I think, in their determination to hive off sort of mutual interdependence or with China. And key technology areas. I think that the US can do that because of how it's situated economically. I think it's much harder for the EU, particularly given the sort of challenge, the economic harm of the Russia invasion, for it to cut itself off from the Chinese market. And so I think sort of trying to find a common way forward on trade with those sort of diverging, directions of travel is going to be very challenging.
Fantastic, thank you. Emily.
I would love for the UK and US to agree some sort of amazing agreement, just like in Marley's report. Well, I had a slightly different take on some of the issues, which I give him in my comments, but I mean, it's a very exciting time for sort of trade and climate innovation right now. And I like that idea of sort of generating model provisions. It reminds me of some of the provisions in the UK New Zealand FTA, where they made a lot of really unprecedented commitments to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and export credit support. If you looked a little deeper, you could see they didn't really go beyond any domestic commitments for various reasons, but just the idea that two countries could say, and Singapore, Australia have done this recently. They have a green economy agreement that you could say, let's strip out everything else and just focus on hammering something out on for example, trade and climate and green economy. I'm not in charge, so I can't make that happen, but I would love it if it did.
Thank you very much. And Graham.
So I'll try to tie together two or three things quickly into one. So I agree with Emily's point that we are moving into a period where trade rules are going to be increasingly important. We've been through decades of tariff reductions. The WTO has been enormously successful in that. There's still some way to go, but if you look at the success over the last 40 years or so, the real gains are going to be, yes, continuing along that curve, but also in terms of non-tariff barriers, it's going to be around services, and it's also going to be about how we trade, the systems that we use to trade, and that brings in the digital component that Morrison was asking about. I think digital and services is key. It's key both because the UK and US have huge services sectors. The UK, it's over 80% of GDP. And we often get fixated on particular issues around agricultural goods, important though they are. Sometimes we forget that in fact it's in services where real gains are going to be made. And in terms of digital, what we've been doing in the UK is to have a vision for ourselves to be a leader in cutting edge digital trade agreements, digital provisions in our FTAs. We've done that with Australia, New Zealand, Norway, Japan we did as well. Obviously with our UK, Singapore digital economy agreement, most recently, which some people are calling the most innovative trade deal in the world. All of these are ways in which we are moving forwards, bottom up, towards a digital trade regime. And that's important because modern trade is digital. And we need to do that top down. We brokered the G7 digital trade principles last year under the UK presidency. A real first. People said we couldn't do it. Get the US and the EU together, agree common principles around digital trade. We did it, Canada and Japan as well. So I do think that these things are very challenging. Clearly they are. We come from different starting points, which makes it even more challenging. But these are really important issues, whether we're talking about climate, whether we're talking about ensuring that we maintain the global economy. Because what we're seeing now in the global economy is the real impact on people's lives and people's quality of life when the global economy does not function in the way that we've expected it to function over the last couple of decades. We've got to ensure that trade is a major driver for the future, as it is now and has been in the past. But we also need to address these issues around digital, around climate, around workers. I think we can do that. It's going to be tough, but we have an obligation to get on and do it, roll up our sleeves and try to make something happen. So that's our intention in the UK, and we'll see how far we can get.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for sharing your thoughts on that no small task. So it just falls to me to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists, to all of our audience for fantastic questions, and for taking time out of your day to discuss this. So do read Marley's work, do follow him on Twitter for more insights, and do keep up with IPPR's work more generally.